On board the spacecraft, the astronauts preset the timer, enclose themselves in capsules, and fall into a deep hibernation that'll carry them several hundred years into the future. This is a familiar scene in many sci-fi films, but could humans ever actually hibernate in real life? Researchers interested in this question turn to the animal kingdom, where hibernation is commonplace, occurring in over 200 species that we know of. Take the Arctic ground squirrel.
Oh my god, no
Native
you.
to the North American tundra and northern Russia, this animal burrows beneath the permafrost and slips into a state of
Oh
suspended
shit, he has
animation.
no.
Its body temperature
He has no
plummeting
basket.
to frigid
Holy shit.
-2.9 degrees Celsius.
Right.
Others,
He has
like
no
the female
basket.
black bear, can multitask, giving birth and lactating while they're hibernating through the winter.
Suffer time.
The fat-tailed dwarf lemur prepares for its long dormancy by gorging on food and storing the majority of its fat reserves in
Oh my
its
god,
tail,
no you.
doubling its body weight. After hibernation, it emerges looking as svelte as ever. So why do these animals go to such extremes? Hibernation is a necessity. A survival tactic for making it through the harsh winter
so good,
months
man.
when dwindling food and water reserves
Definitely
threaten
not.
survival. For many years, experts believed hibernation happened only
How?
in Arctic and temperate environments.
He hasn't even
But more
scored.
recently, they've discovered animals hibernating even in arid deserts and tropical rainforests. As
No, I
hibernation
think
kicks in,
Paulo Felix
animals'
is still
heartbeats usually slow
still
to
be
about
better.
1 to 3% of their original speed. Like the dwarf lemurs,
seems
which
hopeless,
drops
man.
from its usual roughly 180
I think
beats per minute to just around
it should be
4.
better.
Breathing also declines dramatically to just one breath every 10 to 21 minutes in the lemur
Let's just give it a
stage.
try first. I
And
think
black
we can
bears,
get somewhere
like most
secondary.
pollinators, don't urinate or defecate the entire hibernation period. Hibernating animals appear to stay alive by having very much blood and oxygen. And scans of hibernating animals reveal that their brain activity has just about flatlined. But hibernation isn't a long winter's nap. As far as researchers know, in lemurs and ground squirrels anyways, the animals aren't even sleeping for most of it. Hibernation is actually made up of regular bouts of reduced metabolic rate and body temperature. Animals can be in torpor for a few days, after which they resume normal metabolic rate and body temperature for about 24 hours before going back to the phenomenon think about arousal. The behaviors inherent in hibernation, like going 5 weeks without sleep or dropping to near freezing body temperatures, would be potentially fatal to non-hibernating species like us. To find out how hibernators are able to do this, researchers
thing
turned
is,
their attention to those animals' genes.
Silverwing always stay
So far,
too
they've
far
discovered that
from
hibernation is controlled by genes that
Alicia,
turn
so
off
that's
and
why
on in unique
we will
patterns
probably not
throughout the
get
year,
any
fine-tuning
Jensen
the
and Booth.
hibernator's physiology and behavior. For example,
So
ground squirrel,
maybe,
bear, and
Margrave?
dwarf lemur studies
I think
have
Margrave
revealed that these animals are able to
can
turn
work.
on the genes that control fat metabolism precisely when they need to use
Margrave,
their fat stores
because
as
Irene
fuel to
sucks.
survive long periods of fasting. And the genes in question are present in all mammals, which means that researchers could study hibernating mammals to see how their unique control of physiology might help humans. Understanding how hibernators deal with reduced blood flow could lead to better treatments for protecting the brain during a stroke.
It isn't
Figuring
her.
out how
Oh,
these
yeah, it's
animals
her.
avoid muscle deterioration might improve the lives of bedridden patients.
Damn.
And studying how hibernating animals
Bed.
control their weight with ease could illuminate the relationship between metabolism and weight gain in humans. And yes, more research in this area might someday make human hibernation a real possibility. Imagine our surprise if the huge intergalactic travel turns out to be black bears. Check out our Patreon page at patreon.com/TEDEd.
Massive vines that blanket the southern United States, climbing as high as 100 feet as they uproot trees and swallow buildings. A ravenous snake that is capable of devouring an alligator. rabbit populations that eat themselves into starvation. These aren't horror movie concepts, they're real stories. But how do
Damn.
such situations exist in nature?
Where SB?
All three are examples of invasive species. Organisms harmful not because of what they are, but where they happen to be. The Kudzu Vine, for example, had grown quietly in its native East Asia, eaten by various insects and dying off during the cold winters. But its fortunes changed when it was imported into the southeastern United States for porch decoration and cattle feed. Its planting was even subsidized by the government to fight soil erosion. With sunny fields, a mild climate, and no natural predators in its new home, the vine grew uncontrollably until it became known as the plant that ate the South. Meanwhile, in Florida's Everglades, Burmese pythons
I doubt if we can even get
are the
a
cause
600.
of decreasing populations of organisms. They're successfully outcompeting top predators, such as the alligator and panther, causing a significant reduction in their food sources. They're not a problem in their native Asia because
cannot hit
diseases,
her. That's the
parasites,
problem.
and predators help to control their population size.
Vì nó là hết show thì nó
And
sẽ
in
mạnh thôi.
Australia, European rabbits eat so many plants that they wipe out the food supply for themselves and other herbivores. They're a pretty recent addition, intentionally introduced to the continent because one man enjoyed hunting them. Like the Burmese pythons, various factors in their native habitat keep their numbers in control. But in Australia, the lack of predators and a climate perfect for year-long reproduction allows their populations
man.
to skyrocket. So why does this keep happening? Most of the world's ecosystems are the result of millennia of co-evolution by organisms, adapting to their environment and each other until a stable balance is reached. Healthy ecosystems maintain this balance via limiting factors, environmental conditions that restrict the size or range of a species. These include things like natural geography and climate, food availability, and the presence
Does this
or
even matter?
absence of predators. For example, plant growth depends on levels of sunlight and soil nutrients. The amount of edible plants affects the population of herbivores, which in turn impacts the carnivores that feed on them. And a healthy predator population keeps the herbivores from becoming too numerous and devouring all the plants. But even minor changes in one factor can upset this balance, and the sudden introduction of non-native organisms can be a pretty major change. A species that is evolved in a separate habitat will be susceptible to different limiting factors, different predators, different energy sources, and different climates. If the new habitat's limiting factors fail to restrict the species' growth, it will continue to multiply, outcompeting native organisms for resources and disrupting the entire ecosystem. Species are sometimes introduced into new habitats through natural factors like storms, ocean currents, or climate shifts. The majority of invasive species, though, are introduced by humans. Often this happens unintentionally, as when the zebra mussel was accidentally brought to Lake Erie by cargo ships. But as people migrate around the world, we have also deliberately brought our plants and animals along, rarely considering the consequences. But now that we're learning more about the
It's so
effects
freaking
of
dead.
invasive species on ecosystems, many governments closely monitor the transport of plants and animals and ban the imports of certain organisms. But could the species with the most drastic environmental impact be a group of primates who emerged from Africa to cover most of the world? Are we an invasive species?
So freaking dead.
この戦いは私たちの
Where's
勝利です
damage? Where SV?
This is Goliath the krill. Don't
Sorry,
get
six-
attached. Today, this 1 centimeter crustacean will share the same fate as 40 million of his closest friends. A life sentence in the belly of the largest blue whale in the world. Let's call
Hi,
her
Where
Leviathan.
busted? Hi, yeah.
Leviathan weighs something like 150 metric tons, and she's the largest animal in the world. But she's not even close to being the largest organism by weight, which is estimated to equal about 40 leviathans. So where is this behemoth? Here, in Utah. Sorry,
I'll try
that's
again.
too close.
Wait.
Here.
That looks like
This is
correct.
pando, whose name means I spread out. Pando, a quaking aspen, has roughly 47,000 genetically identical clone trunks.
Yeah, even
Those
Korath
all
has
grow from
tested.
one enormous root system, which is why scientists consider pando a single organism. Pando is the clear winner of world's largest organism by weight, an incredible 6 million kilograms. So how did pando get to be so huge? Pando is not an unusual aspen from a genetic standpoint. Rather, pando's size boils down to 3 main factors: its age, its location, and aspen's remarkable evolutionary adaptation of self-cloning. So first, pando is incredibly expansive because it's incredibly old. How old exactly? No one knows. Dendrochronologist estimates range from 80,000 to 1 million years. The problem is, there's no simple way to gauge pando's age. Counting the rings of a single trunk will only account for up to 200 years or so, as pando is in a constant cycle of growth, death, and renewal. On average, each individual tree lives 130 years before falling and being replaced by new ones. Second, location. During the last ice age, which ended about 12,000 years ago, glaciers covered much of the North American climate friendly to aspens. So if there were other comparably sized clonal colonies, they may have perished then. Meanwhile, Pando's corner of Utah remained glacier-free. The soil there is rich in nutrients that Pando continuously replenishes. As it drops leaves and trunks, the nutrients return to nourish new generations of clones. Which brings us to the third cause of Pando's size, cloning. Aspens are capable of both sexual reproduction, which produces a new organism, and asexual reproduction, which creates a clone. They tend to reproduce sexually when conditions are unfavorable, and the best strategy for survival is to move elsewhere. Trees aren't particularly mobile, but their seeds are. Like the rest of us, sexual reproduction is how Pando came into the world in the first place, all those tens or hundreds of thousands of years ago. The wind, or a pollinator, carried pollen from the flower of one of its parents to the other, where a sperm cell fertilized the egg. That flower produced fruit, which split open, releasing hundreds of tiny ripe seeds. The wind carried one to a wet spot of land in what is now Utah, where it took root and germinated into Pando's first seed. A couple of years later, Pando grew mature enough to reproduce asexually. Asexual reproduction, or cloning, tends to happen when the environment is favorable to growth. Aspens have long
still dead,
roots
man.
that burrow through the soil. These can sprout shoots that grow up into new trunks. And while Pando grew and spread out, so did our ancestors. As hunter-gatherers who made cave paintings, survived an ice age, found their way to North America, built civilizations in Egypt and Mesopotamia, fought wars, domesticated animals, fought wars, formed nations, built machines, and invented the internet, and always newer ways to fight wars. Pando has survived many millennia of changing climates and encroaching ice, but it may not survive us. New stems are growing to maturity much more slowly than they need to in order to replace the trunks that fall. Scientists have identified 2 main reasons for this. The first is that we've deprived Pando of fire. When a fire clears a patch of forest, aspen roots survive and send shoots bursting up out of the ground by the tens of thousands. And secondly, grazers, like herds of cattle and mule deer, whose natural predators we've hunted to the point of local elimination, are eating Pando's fresh growth. If we lose the world's largest organism, we'll lose a scientific treasure trove. Because pando's trunks are genetically identical, they can serve as a controlled setting for studies on everything from the tree microbiome to the influence of climate on tree growth rates. The good news is we have a chance to save pando by reducing livestock grazing in the area and further protecting the vulnerable young saplings. And the time to act is today. Because, as with so many other marvels of our natural world, once they're gone, it will be a very, very long time before they return. If being a part of the movement to save our planet sounds exciting to you, join Countdown, a global initiative bringing together scientists, activists, urban planners, farmers, artists, and you. Together, we're turning innovative solutions into planet-saving realities. Get informed and get involved at countdown.ted.com. On an auspicious day in November of 1986, 5 Australian miners climbed Emergent Hill, so named for the mental state they are being. While their competitors searched for opals of depth of 2 to 5 meters, the Lunatic Hill Syndicate poured 20 meters into the earth.
Where's the trauma?
For their audacity, the earth rewarded them with a fist-sized, record-breaking opal. They named it the Hades Comet Opal, after the much larger, rocky, icy body flying by the earth on that planet. The Hades Comet Opal, but its uniqueness is, paradoxically, the most usual thing about it. While diamonds, rubies, emeralds, and other precious stones are often indistinguishably similar, no two opals look the same, thanks to a characteristic called play of color. This shimmering, dazzling, dancing display of light comes about from a confluence of chemistry, geology, and optics that define opals from their earliest moments. It's there that an opal begins its life as something surprisingly abundant. Trickling down through gaps in soil and rock, water flows through sandstone, limestone, and basalt, picking up a microscopic compound called silicon dioxide. This silica-enriched water enters the voids inside pieces of volcanic rock, prehistoric riverbeds, wood, and even the bones of ancient creatures. Gradually, the water starts to evaporate, and the silica solution begins forming a gel, within which millions of silica spheres form layer by layer as a series of concentric shells. The gel ultimately hardens into a glass-like material, and the spheres settle into a lattice structure. The vast majority of the time, this structure is haphazard, resulting in common or potch opals with unremarkable exteriors. The tiny, mesmerizing percentage we call precious opals have regions where silica beads of uniform size form orderly lines. So why do those structures produce such complex displays? The answer lies in the principle of wavelengths called interference. For the sake of simplicity, let's see what happens when a single color of light, green with a wavelength of 500 nanometers, hits a precious opal. The green light will scatter throughout the gemstone and reflect back with varying intensity. From most angles, suffused, from some entirely dim,
she's too far
and
away.
others dazzlingly bright.
So
What's
each
happening
rotation
is
will cost me
some
like
of the green light reflects
60
off
points.
of the top layer. Some reflects off of the layer below that, and so on. When the additional distance it travels from one layer to the next and back is a multiple wavelength, such as 500 or 1000 extra nanometers, the crests and valleys of the waves match each other.
The hell?
This phenomenon is called constructive interference, and it amplifies the wave, producing a brighter color. So if you position your eye at the correct angle, the green light reflecting from many layers adds together. Shift the angle just a bit, and you change the distance the light travels between layers. Change it enough, and you'll reach a point where the crests match the valleys, making the waves cancel each other out. That's destructive interference. Different colors have different properties, which translates to varying distances they have to travel to destructively interfere. That's why colors roughly correspond to certain bead sizes. The spaces between 210 nanometer beads are just right to amplify blue light. For red light, with its long wavelengths, the silica beads must be close to 300 nanometers. Those take a very long time to form, and because of that, red is the rarest color. The differences in the arrangements of the gel lattices within a particular stone result in a wide range of color patterns. Everything from broad flash to pinfire to the ultra-rare harlequin. The circumstances that lead to the formation of precious opal are so uncommon that they only occur in a handful of places. About 95% come from Australia, where an ancient inland sea created perfect conditions. It was there that the Halley's Comet opal formed some 100 million years ago. Which raises the question, in the next 100 million years, silica-rich water will percolate through the nooks and crannies of some of the discarded artifacts of human civilization. What opalescent plays of light will one day radiate from the things we familiar with darkness? Not all precious materials are quite so native to our planet. Guess where gold comes from? Outer space. Learn more about the extraterrestrial origins of one of Earth's most precious metals with this video.
Deep beneath the geysers and hot springs of the Yellowstone caldera lies a magma chamber,
Damn,
produced by a
so
hot
freaking
spot
dead.
in Earth's mantle. As the magma moves towards the Earth's surface, it crystallizes to form young, hot, igneous rocks. The heat from these rocks drives
Sheesh.
groundwater towards the surface. As the water cools, ions precipitate out as mineral crystals, including quartz crystals from silicon
Damn.
and oxygen, feldspar from potassium, aluminum, silicon, and oxygen, galena from lead and sulfur. Many of these crystals have signature shapes. Take this cascade of pointed quartz or this pile of galena cubes. But what causes them to grow into these shapes again and again? Part of the answer lies in their atoms. Every crystal's atoms are arranged in a highly organized, repeating pattern. This pattern is the defining feature of a crystal and isn't restricted to minerals. Sand, ice, sugar, chocolate, ceramics, metals, DNA, and even some liquids have crystalline structures. Each crystalline
Actually not.
material's atomic arrangement falls into one of 6 different families: cubic, tetragonal, orthogonal, monoclinic, triclinic, and hexagonal. Given the appropriate conditions, crystals will grow into geometric shapes that reflect the arrangement of their atoms. Take galena, which has a cubic structure composed of lead and sulfur atoms. The relatively large
Completely
lead atoms
hit the
are
pillar.
arranged in a 3-dimensional grid 90 degrees from one another, while the relatively small sulfur atoms fit neatly between them. As the crystal grows, locations like these attract sulfur atoms, while lead will tend to bond to these places. Eventually,
Well,
they will
her
complete the
passive
grid
of
of bonded
40 SD,
atoms.
remember?
This means the 90-degree
40
grid
and then
pattern of
90
galena's
from
crystalline
default.
structure is
Let's add up
reflected in the
to
visible
130.
shape of the crystal. Quartz, meanwhile, has a hexagonal crystalline structure. This means that on one plane, its atoms are arranged in hexagons. In 3 dimensions, these hexagons are composed of many interlocking fluids made up of 1 silicon atom and 4 oxygen atoms. So the signature shape of a quartz crystal is a 6-sided column with pointed tips. Depending on environmental conditions, most crystals have the potential to form multiple geometric shapes. For example, diamonds, which form deep in the Earth's mantle, have a cubic crystalline structure and can grow into either cubes or octahedrons. Which shape a particular diamond grows into depends on the conditions where it grows. including pressure, temperature, and chemical environment. While we can't directly observe growth conditions in the mantle, laboratory experiments have shown some evidence that diamonds tend to grow into cubes at lower temperatures and octahedrons at higher temperatures. Trace amounts of water, silicon, germanium, or magnesium might also influence a diamond's shape, and diamonds never naturally grow into the shapes found in jewelry. Those diamonds have been cut to showcase sparkle and clarity. Environmental conditions can also influence whether crystals form at all. Glass is made of melted quartz sand, but it isn't crystalline. That's because glass cools relatively quickly, and the atoms do not have time to arrange themselves into the ordered structure of a quartz crystal. Instead, the random arrangement of the atoms in melted glass is locked into a cooler. Many crystals don't form geometric shapes because they grow in extremely close quarters with other crystals. Rocks like granite are full of crystals, but none have recognizable shapes. As magma cools and solidifies, many minerals within it crystallize at the same time and quickly run out of space. And certain crystals, like turquoise, don't grow into any discernible geometric shape in most environmental conditions, even given adequate space. Every crystal's atomic structure has unique properties, and while these properties may not have any bearing on human emotional needs, they do have powerful applications in materials science and medicine.
So 600 is possible, but
Glass,
I'm short
or
on
what
SB.
fire
I
is
don't know
made of?
why.
Did you know gold doesn't originally come from our planet? Find out more about the
don't have enough
fascinating
SB.
makeup of our environment with this playlist.
Wait, what? Where's damage?
Most of the forest lives in the shadow of the giants that make up the highest canopy. These are the oldest trees, with hundreds of children and thousands of grandchildren. They check in with their neighbors, sharing food, supplies, and basic exchange over their many lives.
Oh, fuck.
They do all this rooted in place, unable to speak, reach out, or move around. The secret to their success lies under the forest floor, where vast root systems support the towering trunks above. Partnering with these roots are symbiotic fungi called mycorrhizae. These fungi have countless branching, thread-like hyphae that together make up the mycelium. The mycelium spreads across a much larger area than the tree root system and connects the roots of different trees together. These connections form mycorrhizal networks. Through mycorrhizal networks, fungi can pass resources and signaling molecules between the trees. We know the oldest trees have the largest mycorrhizal networks with the most connections to other trees, but these connections are incredibly complicated to trace. That's because there are about 100 species of mycorrhizal fungi, and an individual tree might be colonized by dozens of different fungal organisms, each of which connects to a unique set of other trees, which in turn each have their own unique set of fungal associations. To get a sense of how substances flow through this network, let's zoom in on sugar as they travel from a mature tree to a neighboring seed. Sugar's journey starts high above the ground, in the leaves of the tallest trees above the canopy. The leaves use the anthoxin nitroxide to create sugars through photosynthesis. This essential fuel then travels through the tree to the base of the trunk in the thickest family. From there, sugar flows down to the roots. Mycorrhizal fungi encounter the tips of the roots and either surround or penetrate the outer root cells, depending on the type of fungi. Fungi cannot produce sugars, though they need them for fuel just like trees do. They can, however, collect nutrients from soil much more efficiently than tree roots, and pass these nutrients into the tree. In general, substances flow from where they are more abundant to where they are less abundant. They can source.
What the
That means that
I got
sugars
paralyzed?
flow from the tree roots
Holy
into the
shit.
fungal hyphae.
Holy,
Once the
I got
sugars
paralyzed.
enter the fungus, they travel along the hyphae through pores between cells,
Oh, just give up
or
then.
through special hollow transporter hyphae. The fungus absorbs some of the sugars, but some travels on and enters the roots of a neighboring tree. a seedling that grows in the shade and has less opportunity to photosynthesize sugars. But why does fungus transport resources from tree
don't have
to
much
tree?
hope retaining
This is one of the mysteries of the mycorrhizal network.
bracket.
It makes sense for fungus to exchange soil nutrients and sugar with a tree. Both parties benefit.
Wow, so freaking dead.
The fungus likely benefits in less obvious ways from being part of a network between trees, but the exact ways aren't totally clear. Maybe the fungus benefits from having connections with as many different trees as possible, and maximizes its connections by shuttling molecules between trees. Or maybe plants reduce their contributions to fungi if the fungi don't facilitate exchanges between trees. Whatever the reasons, these fungi pass an incredible amount of information between trees. Through the mycorrhizae,
Let's try
trees
this.
can tell when nutrients or signaling molecules are coming from a member of their own species or not. They can even tell when information is coming from a close relative, like a sibling or parent. Trees can also share information about events like drought or insect attacks through their fungal networks, causing their neighbors to increase production of protective enzymes in anticipation of threats. The forest's health relies on these intricate communications and exchanges. With everything so deeply interconnected, what impacts one species is bound to impact others. So trees can sound the alarm during an emergency, but how exactly do they defend themselves? Check out this video for the mind-boggling answer.
Dead booba. Oh shit, I haven't even done the MA.
Billions of years ago, on the young planet Earth, simple organic compounds assembled into more complex coalitions that could grow and reproduce. They were the very first life on Earth, and they gave rise to every one of the billions of species that have inhabited our planet since. At the time, Earth was almost completely devoid of what we'd recognize as a suitable environment for living things. The young planet had widespread volcanic activity and an atmosphere that created hostile conditions. So where on Earth could life begin?
Yes, it's true.
To begin the search for the cradle of life, it's important to first understand the basic necessities for any life form. Elements and compounds essential to life include hydrogen, methane, nitrogen, carbon dioxide, phosphates, and ammonia. In order for these ingredients to commingle and react with each other, they need a liquid solvent, water. And in order to grow and reproduce, all life needs a source of energy. Life forms are divided into two camps: autotrophs, like plants, that generate their own energy, and heterotrophs, like animals, that consume other organisms for energy. The first life form wouldn't have had other organisms to consume, of course, so it must have been an autotroph, generating energy either from the sun or from chemical gradients. So what locations meet these criteria? Places on land or close to the surface of the ocean have the advantage of access to sunlight. But at the time when life began, the UV radiation on Earth's surface was likely too harsh for life to survive there. One setting offers protection from this radiation and an alternative energy source: the hydrothermal vents that wind across the ocean floor, covered by kilometers of seawater and bathed in complete darkness. A hydrothermal vent is a fissure in the Earth's crust where seawater seeps into magma chambers and is ejected back out at high temperatures, along with a rich slurry of minerals and simple chemical compounds. Energy is particularly concentrated at the steep chemical gradients of hydrothermal vents. There's another group of evidence that points to hydrothermal vents, the last universal common ancestor of life, or LUCA for short. LUCA wasn't the first life form, but it's as far back as we can trace. Even so, we don't actually know what LUCA looks like. There's no LUCA fossil, no modern-day LUCA still around. Instead, scientists identified genes that are commonly found in species across all three domains of life that exist today. Since these genes are shared across species and domains, they must have been inherited from a common ancestor. These shared genes tell us that Luca lived in a hot, oxygen-free place and harvested energy from a chemical gradient, like the ones at hydrothermal vents. There are two kinds of hydrothermal vent,
Give a shout.
black smokers and white smokers. Black smokers release acidic carbon dioxide-rich water heated to hundreds of degrees Celsius and packed with sulfur, iron, copper, and other metals essential to life. But scientists now believe that black smokers were too hot for Luca, so now the top candidates for the cradle of life are white smokers. Among the white smokers, a field of hydrothermal vents on the mid-Atlantic ridge called Lost City has become the most favored candidate for the cradle of life. The seawater expelled here is highly alkaline and lacks carbon dioxide, but is rich in methane and offers more hospitable temperatures. Adjacent black smokers may have contributed the carbon dioxide necessary for life to evolve at Lost City, giving it all the components to support the first organisms that radiated into the incredible diversity of life on Earth today. Did you know that a single-celled organism caused the first mass extinction? Check out this animation about how it almost wiped out life on Earth and paved the way for complex life. Earliest time measurements were observations of cycles of the natural world, using patterns of changes from day to night and season to season to build calendars. More precise timekeeping, like sundials and mechanical clocks, eventually came along to put time in more convenient boxes. But what exactly is it that we're measuring? Is time something that physically exists? Or is it just in our heads? At first, the answer seems obvious. Of course time exists. It constantly unfolds all around us, and it's hard to imagine the universe without it. But our understanding of time started getting complicated thanks to Einstein. His theory of relativity tells us that time passes for everyone, but doesn't always pass at the same rate for people in different situations, like those traveling close to the speed of light, or orbiting a supermassive black hole. Einstein resolved the malleability of time by combining it with space to define space-time, which can bend but behaves in consistent, predictable ways. Einstein's theory seemed to confirm that time is woven into the very fabric of the universe. But there's a big question it didn't fully resolve. Why is it we can move through space in any direction, but through time in only one? No matter what we do, the past is always stubbornly behind us. This is called the arrow of time. When a drop of food coloring is dropped into a glass of water, we instinctively know that the coloring will drift out from the drop, eventually filling the glass. Imagine watching the opposite happen. Here, we'd recognize time as unfolding backwards. We live in a universe where the food coloring spreads out in the water, not a universe where it collects together. In physics, this is described by the second law of thermodynamics, which says that systems will gain disorder or entropy over time. Systems in our universe move from order to disorder, and it is that property of the universe that defines the direction of time's arrow. So, if time is such a fundamental property, it should be in our most fundamental equations describing the universe, right? We currently have two sets of equations that govern physics. General relativity describes the behavior of very large things, while quantum physics explains the very small. One of the biggest goals in theoretical physics over the last half-century has been reconciling the two into one fundamental theory of everything. There have been many attempts, none yet proven, and they treat
Bảng này
time
nhanh vậy.
in different ways. Oddly enough, one contender called the Wheeler-DeWitt equation doesn't include time at all. Like all current theories of everything, that equation is speculative. But as a thought experiment, if it or a similarly time-starved equation turned out to be true, would that mean that time doesn't exist at the most fundamental level? Could time just be some sort of illusion generated by the limitations of the way we perceive the universe? We don't yet know. But maybe that's the wrong way of thinking about it. Instead of asking if time exists as a fundamental property, maybe it could exist as an emergent one. Emergent properties are things that don't exist in individual pieces of a system, but do exist for the system as a whole. Each individual water molecule doesn't have a tide, but the whole ocean does. A movie creates change through time by using a series of still images that appear to have a fluid, continuous change between them. Flipping through the images fast enough, our brains perceive the passage of time from the sequence of still images. No individual frame of the movie changes or contains the passage of time, but it's a property that comes out of how the pieces are strung together. The movement is real, yet also an illusion. Could the physics of time somehow be a similar illusion? Physicists are still exploring these and other questions, so we're far from a complete explanation, at least for the moment. If time does exist, you'll probably want a brief history of it. Explore more of the fundamental questions of our existence by downloading a free audio version of Stephen Hawking's modern classic at audible.com/TEDx. Every trial created encourages Audible to continue supporting TED's nonprofit mission.
A few months ago, the Nobel Prize in Physics was awarded to two teams of astronomers for a discovery that has been hailed as one of the most important astronomical observations ever. And today, after briefly describing what they found, I'm going to tell you about a highly controversial...
What the fuck? Not this video again.
In February of 1942, Mexican farmer Dionisio Pulido thought he heard thunder coming from his cornfield. However, the sound wasn't coming from the sky. The source was a large smoking crack emitting gas and ejecting rocks. This fissure would come to be known as the volcano Paracutin, and over the next 9 years, its lava and ash would cover over 200 square kilometers. But where did this new volcano come from, and what triggered its unpredictable eruption? The story of any volcano begins with magma. Often this molten rock forms in areas where ocean water is able to slip into the Earth's mantle and lower the layer's melting point. The resulting magma typically remains under the Earth's surface thanks to the delicate balance of two geological factors. The first is lithospheric pressure. This is the weight of the Earth's crust pushing down on the magma below. Magma pushes back with the second factor, magmastatic pressure. The battle between these forces determines the third factor, the rock strength of the Earth's crust. Usually, the rock is strong enough and heavy enough to keep the magma in place, but when this equilibrium is thrown off, the consequences can be explosive. One of the most common causes of an eruption is an increase in magmastatic pressure. Magma contains various elements and compounds, many of which are dissolved in the molten rock. At high enough concentrations, compounds like water or sulfur no longer dissolve, and instead form high-pressure gas bubbles. When these bubbles reach the surface, they can burst with the force of a gunshot. And when millions of bubbles explode simultaneously, the energy can send plumes of ash into the stratosphere. But before they pop, they act like bubbles of CO2 in shaken soda. Their presence lowers the magma's density and increases the buoyant force pushing upward through the crust. Many geologists believe this process was behind the routine eruption in Mexico. There are two known natural causes for these buoyant bubbles. Sometimes new magma from deeper underground brings additional gassy compounds into the mix. But bubbles can also form when magma begins to cool. In its molten state, magma is a mixture of dissolved gases and melted minerals. As the molten rock hardens, some of those minerals solidify into crystals.
Oh shit.
This process doesn't incorporate many of the dissolved gases, resulting in a higher concentration of the compounds that form explosive bubbles. Not all eruptions are due to rising magmastatic pressure. Sometimes the weight of the rock above can become dangerously low. Landslides can remove massive quantities of rock from atop a magma chamber, dropping the lithostatic pressure and instantly triggering an eruption. This process is known as unloading, and it's been responsible for numerous eruptions, including the sudden explosion of Mount St. Helens in 1980. But unloading can also happen over longer periods of time due to erosion or melting glaciers. In fact, many geologists are worried that glacial melt caused by climate change could increase volcanic activity. Finally, eruptions can occur when the rock layer is no longer strong enough to hold back the magma below. Acidic gases and heat escaping from magma can corrode rock through a process called hydrothermal alteration, gradually turning hard stone into soft clay. The rock layer could also be weakened by tectonic activity. Earthquakes can create fissures, allowing magma to escape to the surface, and the Earth's crust can be stretched thin as continental plates shift away from each other. Unfortunately, knowing what causes eruptions doesn't make them easy to predict. While scientists can roughly determine the strength and weight of the Earth's crust, the depth and heat of magma chambers makes measuring changes in magmastatic pressure very difficult. But volcanologists are constantly exploring new technology to conquer this rocky terrain.
Yeah.
Advances in thermal imaging
That's a lot of
allow
damage.
scientists to detect subterranean hotspots. Spectrometers can analyze gases escaping magma, and lasers can precisely track the impact of rising magma on a volcano's shape. Hopefully, these tools will help us better understand these volatile vents and their explosive eruptions. Did you know that there's an destructive kind of volcano known as a supervolcano? 650,000 years ago, the Yellowstone supervolcano covered Find out more about these eruptions.
Damn.
Rockets into space require sacrificing expensive equipment, massive amounts of fuel. Space race of the 20th Okay, so maybe riding an elevator to the stars is transportation, but using a fixed structure to send smaller payloads into orbit would be $7
Damn,
to
so
carry
freaking
into orbit.
dead.
Space elevators are projected to reduce
SB.
that cost by 95%. Researchers have been investigating this idea since 1890. Inspired Russian scientist Konstantin Tsiolkovsky. Tsiolkovsky imagined a structure thousands of kilometers tall, but even a century Fortunately, physics offer attached to a rock. As long as the carousel keeps
Và
spinning,
bận.
the rock and rope
Bận phải
will
chui thôi.
remain horizontal, kept aloft by centrifugal force. If you're holding the rope, you'll feel this inherent inertial acceleration pulling the rock away from the center of the
Hôm nay tí thì vẫn
rotating
tiếp.
carousel. Now, if we replace the carousel with earth, we have just envisioned the modern space elevator, a cable pulled into space by the physics of our spinning planet. For this to work, the counterweight would need to be far enough away that the centrifugal force generated by the Earth's spin is greater than the planet's gravitational pull. These forces balance out at roughly 36,000 kilometers above the surface, so the counterweight should be beyond its height. Objects at this distance are geostationary, meaning they revolve around Earth. The counterweight itself down through the atmosphere to maximize centrifugal acceleration. This and by allowing it to maneuver around cargo can be loaded onto devices called climbers, which would hold packages along the cable and into orbit.
Ủa sao không né được ta, đúng má.
These mechanisms would require huge amounts of electricity, which could be provided by solar panels or potentially even nuclear systems. Current designs and with proper radiation could be catastrophic.
Rồi xong.
But the main problem lies in the cable itself.
Rồi
In
xong.
addition to supporting a massive amount of weight,
Không tin
the
vào cột
cable's
luôn.
material would have to be strong enough to withstand the counterweight's pull. And because this tension and the force of gravity, the thickness would need to vary as well. Engineered materials like carbon nanotubes and diamond nanothreads seem like our best hope for producing materials strong and light enough for the job. But so far, we've only been able to manufacture very small nanotube chains. Another option would be to build one somewhere with weaker or the moon are already possible with existing materials. But the huge economic advantage of owning an Earth-based space elevator has inspired numerous countries to try and some of these in China and Japan are already planning to complete construction by 2050. So once we've extended ourselves into space, what would it take for humans to be able to stay there permanently? It could get us off this. Find out why with this video.
From hostile deserts to lonely islands and the
Làm đâu
highest
nhỉ?
mountains, wherever there is space to expand into, humans do so. So it's hardly surprising that we're already making preparations to set foot on Mars and to create the first permanent colony outside of Earth, maybe even terraform another planet and turn it into a second blue home. But wait, before we can get to the nice future stuff, we first have to complete the second phase of colonization, creating a semi-permanent outpost to prepare the ground for a larger human presence. But doing so will be gruesome. Even for an expansionist species like us, Mars is extreme. At first glance, Mars seems familiar. Polar ice caps, large valleys, liquid water under its surface, and a day barely longer than Earth's. The ideal place for us to go. Unfortunately, Mars is actually a cold, radioactive desert where the ground is painless and breathing is impossible.
Holy
Mars
shit.
is awful. you almost certainly don't want to go there. The pioneers doing the hard work on Mars will have an intensely stressful life filled with incredibly challenging problems never encountered before. But there are plenty of people willing to do that work, and we have the technology to enable them to do it. For this video, we can assume there have been prior missions to Mars to scout out a good place for an outpost, store resources and equipment, and that there's already a moon base that serves as a hub for Mars missions. The first major challenge for our outpost is the fact that Mars is very energy poor. Because of its distance from the Sun, solar power is only 40% as effective as on Earth. But even this weakened sunlight is often obscured for decades by enormous dust storms. Solar power alone will probably not be enough. Alternatives such as wind power and geothermal energy are also unfeasible, as there's hardly any atmosphere and Mars's interior is much too cold. Initially, nuclear technology might be the only option. Since Mars doesn't have easily accessible radioactive elements, the nuclear fuel needs to come from Earth along with the reactor. If we do set it up, it could power our small outpost for the first few years. Unfortunately, all that energy won't be found in we can't breathe. Mars' atmosphere is only 1% as dense as Earth and mostly made up of CO2. So our habitats need to be pressurized and filled with an artificial atmosphere made of nitrogen and oxygen, which comes with more problems. Corners with flat walls and weak points, so the habitats will have rounded and smooth shapes to handle the stress of great pressure differences between the interior and exterior. The airlocks need to be very airtight and work perfectly every time. Without extensive magnetosphere or a dense atmosphere, half of all radiation coming from space reaches the ground. A person on the surface will be subjected to 50 times the radiation that they would be on Earth. 3 years on the surface of Mars exceeds the radiation base limits imposed on NASA astronauts for their entire career. This increases cancer risks significantly. To prevent that, we could shield our habitats with a thick layer of frozen CO2 that can be harvested directly from the atmosphere. Covering the dry ice with a meter of dirt would further increase the level of retention. Sadly, this means almost no windows. From the inside, most living spaces will be enormous tunnels. From the outside, they'll look like burial places. All of this would still not hold back all the radiation, but reduce it just enough to be survivable for long periods of time. It won't, however, protect anyone who ventures inside. So remote-controlled robots will be used for routine work on the surface, while our crew stays inside. Staying inside is a good idea for another reason. Mars dust. It's much quieter than dust on Earth, so it can find its way into the wheels or electronics of our machines. Because it's also very dry, it's electrostatically charged, sticking to everything, like spacesuits. It will be impossible to avoid carrying lots of Mars dust into our habitat and into the lungs of our crew. To make this even worse, Mars's soil is filled with very toxic perchlorate salts. Constant exposure could be deadly. This problem can still be overcome, though. Spacesuits, for example, could be made in a way that they never truly enter the base, but stay attached to the outside of the habitats. Okay, great. Now we've safely isolated humans in terms of energy and air, and protected them from cancer, we just need to feed them. Water is easy to come by if a settlement is positioned near the Martian poles with their thick layers of ice. Growing food is a different kind of challenge, though. Mars's soils are alkaline and lack the vital nitrogen compounds that plants need to grow. Before we can grow anything, we will have to decontaminate the soil, which is difficult and expensive. Then the soil can be fertilized using recycled biological waste. All of this will take a lot of time and is very energy intensive. So we might use aquaponics to raise fish and plants together, making the astronauts' diets more varied and tasty at the same time. This will be an important psychological boost for our overworked crew. All of these things don't solve one fundamental problem, though. Mars has only 38% of Earth's surface gravity, which could cause muscle wasting, bone loss, and cardiovascular problems. While this might be solved in the future by setting up rotating living spaces, for now our crew has to live with low gravity and exercise a lot to slow the degradation down. The crews will probably have to rotate every few years. after being stuck indoors in tight spaces without windows, with the same people, performing the same routines day in, day out, with little contact from the outside world and a lot to worry about. Like Antarctic scientists or submarine staff, they will undergo intense psychological screening to make sure they're mentally resilient enough to handle this lifestyle for several years. Establishing the first real infrastructure on Mars will be extremely taxing work that only a group of very determined and competent people can do. Luckily, we have enough of these on Earth. And there you have it, a small Mars base that will survive for at least a few decades, as long as it's getting a constant supply of resources, parts, nuclear fuel, and crews from Earth. Unfortunately, Mars and Earth are separated by millions of kilometers and orbital periods that leave only a narrow travel window every 2 years. If there's an emergency in the colony, Earth wouldn't be able to help until the next travel window opens. Helpers may arrive on a planet filled with corpses. Settling Mars will be the toughest challenge we have ever faced. It will be gruesome work to establish the infrastructure we need. But we're stubborn, and we like extreme challenges. If we push through Phase 2 of colonization, anything is possible. Cities illuminating the dark Martian night, a hub for travel between the planets, industries setting foot in orbit, terraforming, a true multi-planetary future.
Okay, no hope pretending now.
It's hard, but worth it. And if we're lucky, we might be around long enough to see it happening and cheer on the people who take on these challenges for the benefit of us all.
Such.
Figuring out complex stuff is one of the best feelings ever, especially if you don't have to do it all by yourself. Our friends from Brilliant can help you out with that part. Brilliant is a problem-solving website with a hands-on approach. Instead of just dropping tricky concepts in front of you, they help you unravel them bit by bit and build up to an interesting conclusion. This way, science becomes something you actually do actively and not only hear about. With Brilliant, you can bear down on dozens of interesting courses and puzzles about topics like solar energy, gravity, and astronomy. If you visit brilliant.org/nutshell or click the link in the description, you can sign up for free and learn all kinds of things. And as a bonus for Kurzgesagt viewers, the first 688 people will also get 20% off their annual membership. With Brilliant, you finish your day a little bit smarter. And no Mars dust to deal with, we promise. Can't get enough of Mars?
No Mars dust.
We've also made a poster about it. You can learn some more about the hardships of Mars colonization, or just look at the pretty colors. Go get it here.
What's the next Abyss?
Humans dream about leaving Earth and traveling through the galaxy. But we were born too early to be part of it.
Gonna be
or were we?
Again.
The reality is, we could begin our dream by building a moon base today. We actually do have the technology, and current estimates from NASA and the private sector say it could be done for $20 to $40 billion spread out over about a decade. The price is comparable to the International Space Station or the budget surplus of Germany in 2017.
Damn.
Not that big an investment, really. The payoff would be immeasurable. The moon is a sandbox to develop new technologies and exploit unlimited resources. It would start a new space race and lay the foundation for us to spread out into the solar system and beyond. It would create a vast array of new technologies to benefit us on Earth, and we would all be part of it. So why aren't we doing it? Well, sadly, it's hard to get governments interested in long-term investments in the future of humanity. Let's imagine just doing it. If we start today, how would we build a moon base? Throughout history, colonization happened in phases. In the first phase of the Age of Exploration of the New World, for example, European monarchs funded expeditions to chart and discover and to stake their claims. They planted a flag and set up a camp, but they didn't stay. In the second phase, small missions set up outposts and settlements were founded, which were still very dependent on their home countries for supplies. Some failed, but others survived and established a permanent presence. Only then, in the third phase, did a true colony form to which tradesmen and labourers could emigrate, creating new wealth and opportunities for themselves and their families, sending extreme wealth back to their countries of origin. When we colonize the moon, we'll go through the same three phases, this time without murdering millions of innocent people in the process. The moon is not a welcoming place for living things. A moon day lasts 29 Earth days, with a difference of nearly 300 degrees Celsius between sunlight and shade. There's no atmosphere to shield us from meteorites, big and small, or cosmic radiation. Worse still, the lunar surface is covered in a layer of nasty, jagged dust. The moon is hard, but we're good at doing hard things. In the first phase of lunar colonization, our explorers proved it can be done, that a new world can be reached. This phase started 16 years ago with the Apollo missions.
Jesus.
Since then, satellites like the American Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter have mapped the moon, while rovers like the Chinese U2 have studied the composition of the lunar surface, looking for water ice and plateaus. Phase 1 is more or less complete. We know what we need to know to enter Phase 2. In the second phase, astronauts will build the first moon base, and this could begin today. The first small moon base could be completed in a decade. The First Nation that establishes this base will be akin to the First Nations building outposts in the New World 500 years ago. It's expensive to send rockets to the moon, so we will send as little as possible. The base will be light, with a more than inflatable habitats for crews of no more than 12, and will be deployed somewhere with natural shelter. Options include caves, like underground lava tube tunnels, or craters near the poles where the days are 6 months long. These astronauts will not stay long. The habitat is likely to be abandoned between missions, as solar panels cannot generate electricity during the lunar night. But they'll do the groundwork to enable humans to stay permanently. Our first crew will consist of scientists and engineers who will study the composition of the moon and whose experiments will explore ways of using the available lunar material, say, purifying lunar ice and turning it into water for human use. And water is important for far more than drinking. They can use it to experiment with growing plants for food. Hydrogen fuel cells will store power through the long night, extending astronaut stays. And most importantly, it can be split into hydrogen and oxygen, rocket fuel. By harvesting water from the moon and putting it into orbit, the moon base will supply an orbital depot where scientific missions to Mars and the outer solar system can refuel. Compared to the Earth, it's much easier and cheaper to get things off the moon into orbit. Colonizing Mars may mean starting from the moon. But this isn't a true colony, not yet. The base will be abandoned if funding stops. If we want the base to grow into the third phase, into a true colony, it must become self-sufficient, supporting itself via exports to Earth. Now, private contractors arrive, looking to get rich off lunar resources and support services. If it's cheaper to produce rocket fuel in space, what else can they get rich on? They could extract precious metals, abundant in impact craters, and other raw materials from the lunar regolith. One promising possibility is the mining of helium-3, an isotope that could one day be used in nuclear fusion reactors, something the Chinese lunar exploration program is currently looking into. Future colonists may export helium-3 back to Earth, providing us with cheap and clean fusion energy. Asteroids could be pulled into the moon's orbit and mined. With commercial exports to Earth, the colony is fully in its third phase, self-sufficient and economically productive. Our base will begin using new material in its construction projects if it is to continue growing. Fortunately, lunar soil has all the necessary ingredients to make concrete. Robotic mining rigs can sift the lunar dust for organic molecules and can be used to build huge structures way too massive to be brought from Earth, while advances in 3D printing will make it possible to produce almost everything else the crews need. It's hard to say when exactly the colony becomes self-sustaining. Growth is gradual, experiments are replaced by industry, and the population steadily reaches the hundreds, encompassing more than just scientists. Engineers, pilots, and contractors representing countries and corporations will be present. Two of these people will make a breakthrough. Not scientific, but social. They will have the first extraterrestrial child. Throughout history, the birth of the first child was celebrated as a moment when the seed of a colony finally and irreversibly took
Thiếu
root.
mẹ nó nằm
Here,
nằm cái
it means
nén
that the
luôn.
moon is not just a place for scientists and engineers to work, it's a place for people to live, to raise a family. Once this transition happens, the colony grows rapidly, building more habitats and schools and farms and all the things needed to support the growing population. As our colony grows, all kinds of new technologies will be invented to sustain it. They might develop crops that efficiently recycle carbon dioxide or that grow with very little water. They might find ways to recycle and reuse 100% of their waste, technologies that are extremely valuable for Earth. They could even build the first space elevator in the solar system. With a space elevator, spacecraft, astronauts, and raw materials could be brought back and forth from lunar orbit without needing to use rockets at all. The moon may become a hub for economic activity on a scale that's hard to imagine right now. It's hard to say who will own the colony at this point. Will the first person born on the moon take the national identity of their parents, or will a new generation meld together into a new lunar society? And when existing treaties that bar any nation from owning the moon are inevitably rewritten, will the colonists be given a say? Will they declare independence from the Earth? However it happens, the moon is a perfect sandbox to learn how to colonize the solar system, the perfect project to unify nations, and the only way to guarantee our survival as a species should something
thiếu SP.
tragic happen on Earth.
Nén được
If
vài
we
cái nữa
ever
là
want
ngon
to
rồi.
colonize the Milky Way, we'll have to start somewhere. So why not start there? Why not start now? While unfortunately you can't jump on a spacecraft and go to the moon right now, you can learn more interesting things about space and our universe. And we can even help you with that. Kudzu Vine and Brilliant are collaborating on a 6-part video series about our favourite science and space topics. Kudzu Vine has worked with Brilliant for a while now, and we love what they're doing. In a nutshell, Brilliant teaches you science and maths with a hands-on approach. By solving puzzles yourself, you learn to understand concepts instead of just memorizing facts. If you'd like to feel more like a scientist, go to brilliant.org/nutshell and sign up for free. The first 688 people to use the link get their annual premium membership at a 20% discount and also support our collaboration with Brilliant. Never before in human history have we been richer, more advanced, more powerful. And yet, we feel overwhelmed in the face of rapid climate change. It seems simple on the surface. Greenhouse gases trap energy from the sun and transfer it to our atmosphere. This leads to warmer winters, harsher summers. Dry places become drier and wet places wetter. Countless ecosystems will die while the rising oceans swallow coasts and cities we build. So why don't we just, prevent all of that? Well, it's complicated. The
Má.
public debate about stopping rapid climate change often focuses on a few key features like coal plants, cars, or burping cows. And so the solutions are often simplistic. Rows of solar panels, biking to work, something sustainability. And a huge talking point is personal responsibility. How you should change your lifestyle to prevent rapid climate change, which we'll find out together in the next few minutes. This is one of those videos where we want to encourage you to watch to the end, because to discuss real, doable solutions, we first need to understand the problem. A fuller picture. Modern industrial society, as we constructed it in the last 150 years, is inherently destructive to the planet. Basically, everything we do to make our lives easier, safer, and more comfortable is making things worse for the biosphere. The food we eat, the streets we walk on, the clothes we
Damn.
wear, the gadgets we use, the way we move around, and the pleasant temperatures we artificially create around us. While most people know about the serious impact of energy, beef, cars, and planes, many major polluters are barely ever talked about. The emissions leaking out of landfills are as significant as the emissions of all the jets in the air. More CO2 is released to run our homes than from all cars combined. And the emissions produced when making a new car is equivalent to building just 2 meters of road. So it is nice to switch to electric cars, but they won't solve anything if we keep building roads the same way. Fixing one small part of the industrial system is not enough. Each of the many different parts needs its own solution, and many of them aren't straightforward. But even where we know what to do, just because a solution exists doesn't mean we're able or willing to implement it. There are many grey
What
areas
the fuck?
in the fight against rapid climate change. The most prominent one is the divide between rich and poor. Emissions versus poverty. There is a clear connection between the prosperity of a nation and its carbon emissions. In other
Damn,
words,
so
richer
hard.
people tend to cause more emissions. So the key to fixing climate change is simply for the world's richest to cut back on their extravagant lifestyles, right? While this would help, it wouldn't make the problem go away. This is because 63% of global emissions come from low to middle income countries. Countries where most people are not living extravagantly but are trying to escape poverty at worst and achieve a comfortable lifestyle at best. The unfortunate reality is that currently, escaping poverty and becoming middle class creates unavoidable emissions. So asking developing countries to cut emissions just looks like an attempt to keep them down. It's very hard to argue that a region should protect their primeval forests and spend money on solar panels instead of burning wood when it can't meet basic needs for significant parts of its population. But cutting back is not a popular demand, especially if the countries making these demands got rich by causing environmental damage in the past. So for billions of people, more emissions are a good thing, personally. When we forget about this, we tend to propose unworkable solutions. Take concrete. 8% of CO2 emissions are released by the concrete manufacturing industry. Okay, cool. Stop using concrete, right? But right now, concrete is also a cheap and easy way for growing populations in developing countries to build affordable housing. And there are many examples like that. Even rich countries aren't immune from disagreeing about rapid climate change solutions. Banning coal, gas and oil from the energy mix is slowed down by heated discussions about what should replace them. The citizens can be strictly against nuclear power, but also oppose wind or solar infrastructure in their backyards. In principle, all of these issues can be overcome, but there are things we don't currently know how to overcome. The most problematic one is food. Emit or die. We will soon
Come
need
on.
to feed 10 billion people, and we don't know how to do that without emitting greenhouse gases. Because of the nature of modern food production that requires fertilizers or manure, it's impossible to have zero emissions food. Rice alone emits so much methane each year that it practically equals the emissions of all the air traffic in the world. What's worse is that the foods we like the most emit the most. 57% of food emissions come from animal-based foods, although they make up only 18% of the world's calories and 37% of its protein. And as people across the world grow richer, they want more meat. Traditional diets in most cultures were primarily plant-based with a little meat on top. But with the rise of industrial-style meat production and factory farming, meat has become a staple food. A regular indulgence in developed countries and a symbol of status and wealth in developing countries. Today, about 40% of the world's habitable land is used for
Fuck.
meat production in
I give
some
up.
form or another,
Wait,
the
let's try
size of
again.
North and South America combined. This is land we could otherwise allow native ecosystems to regrow, like forests in the Amazon, and suck carbon out of the atmosphere, but instead, most of it is used to feed animals. The available solutions are uniquely able to make everybody on the political spectrum, rich or poor, unhappy. Meat is highly emotional, and there are a lot of whataboutism arguments floating around, like comparing it to the worst sources of emissions. In the end, it's pretty simple. Eating less meat alone won't stop climate change, but we also can't stop climate change without eating less meat. The same holds true for other things that are less crucial to our survival, but frankly not realistic to make go away, like air travel, overseas shipping, mining, and the production of devices that play YouTube videos. So what does this mean? Do we need to give up our way of life, and can the poor never achieve it? Can't some technology save us so we can continue to drive electric cars and eat meat every day? Solutions versus expenses.
What the fuck?
In principle, this
What the
technology
fuck?
already exists. Direct air capture of CO2 draws carbon dioxide from the air so that it can be stored underground or transformed into products. So why aren't we implementing it in every industry everywhere? Because with the technology we have right now, this would cost some $10 trillion per year, or half the United States GDP. This money has to come from somewhere, and currently no one is offering it. Just dumping these costs on massive polluters like steel mills and coal power stations would double the cost of their products, and so these industries that operate on very tight profit margins would go bankrupt. Getting the government to pay for it seems logical, but a lot of state resources are actually tied up doing the opposite, like subsidizing oil and gas, which seems counterintuitive but follows clear incentives. By artificially keeping fuel prices low, shipping and everyday goods are kept artificially cheap too, which has a major social impact on billions of people around the world. That creates political lobbies and incentives that perpetuate a cycle that makes it so hard to stop fossil fuel production. Meanwhile, very costly solutions for a far-off problem, like carbon capture, seem like they can wait, as technically nobody benefits from it right now. Some argue that a move away from capitalism is the only solution to this mess. Others insist that markets should be even freer without any interventions like subsidies, and some suggest that we need what's referred to as degrowth, and to cut back as a species overall. But the truth is, at least as of now, no political system is doing an impressive job at becoming truly sustainable, and none have really done so in the past. We also don't have the time to figure this out and do a lot of experiments. We must implement solutions now. Not just to halt the release of all possible greenhouse gases, but also to start reducing the amount of CO2 in the air. It's too late to just mend our ways. We have to actively correct our past mistakes. With every year we waste, more extreme changes will be unavoidable. Okay, let's take a deep breath. Rapid climate change and the world we live in are complicated. So here is where you, dear viewer, come in again. Could you please fix the climate? The narrative of our time is that we are all responsible for rapid climate change, that everyone needs to play their part. Why don't you buy a new electric car? Why don't you replace your gas stove with an electric one?